My name is Martha, and I'm 22 years old. Standing at my college graduation ceremony wearing my cap and gown, I thought this would be the proudest day of my life. For 4 years, I'd pushed myself through countless sleepless nights, maintaining a perfect GPA, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my father would finally see my worth. But as I watched him sitting in the audience, with that familiar look of disapproval, I felt the weight of the envelope in my purse. The envelope I'd been carrying for 6 months, waiting for the right moment. Little did I know that today, my father would give me the perfect opportunity to reveal a family secret that would change everything forever. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking family revelations like this one. Trust me, what happens next will blow your mind, so stick around until the end, because the family secret I'm about to reveal will leave you speechless. Growing up in our pristine suburban home felt like living in a museum where I was the unwanted exhibit. My father, Harold, was everything you'd expect from a successful businessman in his late 50s. Tall, imposing, with steel gray hair perfectly styled, and suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He owned 3 car dealerships across the state and never let anyone forget it. Success was his religion, and control was his weapon of choice. Harold had this way of making you feel small without raising his voice. A raised eyebrow when I brought home an A- instead of an A+. A disappointed sigh when I chose to study literature instead of business. Every conversation felt like a performance review, where I was always falling short of his impossible standards. My mother, Rose, was Harold's perfect complement in all the worst ways. Where he was commanding, she was submissive. Where he was loud in his disapproval, she was silent in her acceptance. Rose had been beautiful once. I could see it in old photographs, before years of walking on eggshells had carved permanent worry lines around her green eyes. She moved through our house like a ghost, always anticipating Harold's needs, always trying to smooth over his rough edges before they could cut too deep. The difference in how Harold treated me versus my younger brother Dennis was like night and day. Dennis was 19, charming in that effortless way that some people are born with, and he could do no wrong in Harold's eyes. When Dennis barely scraped through high school with C's, Harold praised his street smarts. When Dennis crashed Harold's BMW at 17, it was just boys being boys. But when I graduated as valedictorian from the same high school, Harold's only comment was that I should have been more well-rounded instead of just book smart. I threw myself into academics like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. Every scholarship I earned, every academic award I received, every perfect test score was my desperate attempt to prove I deserved to be in this family. I studied until my eyes burned, took on extra credit projects that other students wouldn't dream of attempting, and sacrificed any semblance of a normal teenage social life. All for those rare moments when Harold might nod approvingly, or Rose might smile with genuine pride. But no matter what I achieved, it never seemed to be enough. When I got into 3 Ivy League schools, Harold questioned whether I had actually earned it, or if it was just affirmative action. When I maintained my perfect GPA through college while working 2 part-time jobs, he suggested I wasn't challenging myself enough. The goalpost kept moving, and I kept chasing it like a fool. The only person in our family who truly saw me was my grandmother Eleanor, Harold's mother. At 78, she was sharp as a tack and twice as fierce. Eleanor had raised Harold as a single mother after her husband died in the Korean War, or so the family story went. She lived in a cozy cottage about 20 minutes from our house, and it became my sanctuary whenever the pressure at home became too much to bear. Eleanor had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. She'd listened to my dreams about becoming a professor, about traveling to Europe to research medieval literature, about maybe writing a novel someday. She never once suggested I should be more practical or more like Dennis. In her living room, surrounded by her collection of antique books and the smell of fresh-baked cookies, I felt like I could breathe. Sometimes I'd catch Eleanor watching Harold with this strange expression, like she was seeing someone she didn't quite recognize. When I was younger, I thought it was just the natural concern of a mother watching her son struggle with the pressures of business and family. Now I realize she was carrying secrets that were eating her alive, secrets that would explain why Harold could never quite look at me with the same love he had for Dennis. The discovery that would change everything happened on a crisp October afternoon, 6 months before my graduation. Eleanor had asked me to help her sort through some old photo albums and boxes of memorabilia that had been cluttering her attic for decades. It was the kind of task that could have been tedious, but with Eleanor, even organizing old photographs became an adventure filled with stories about relatives I'd never met and family history I'd never heard. We were sitting cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes and manila envelopes, when Eleanor suddenly went very quiet. She was holding an old photograph, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at it. The picture showed a young woman who looked remarkably like my mother, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. But what caught my attention was the way Eleanor was looking at that photograph, like it contained the weight of the world. "Grandmother," I said gently, "are you okay?" Eleanor looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and for the first time in my life, she looked every one of her 78 years. "Martha, honey, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was too much of a coward." She set the photograph aside and reached into one of the boxes, pulling out a manila envelope that was thick with documents. Her hands were shaking as she opened it, and I could see official-looking papers inside. DNA test results from the header I could make out. My heart started racing even before she began to explain. "Your father," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harold isn't your biological father." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room, and for a moment, I couldn't process what she just said. It was impossible. I looked like Harold, didn't I? We had the same stubborn jawline, the same dark hair. But as Eleanor continued talking, pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed began falling into place. 23 years ago, my mother Rose had been working as a secretary at Harold's first car dealership. She was young, beautiful, and caught between two very different men. Harold was ambitious and successful, already showing signs of the businessman he would become. But Rose was also involved with James Richardson, Harold's business partner at the time. James was kind, gentle, everything that Harold wasn't. And Rose was pregnant with me. Eleanor explained how Rose had confided in her during those early months of pregnancy, torn between the man she loved and the man who could provide financial security. Harold knew about Rose's relationship with James, and he also knew there was a possibility that the baby wasn't his. But Harold wanted Rose, wanted the perfect family image that would help his business, and he was willing to overlook the paternity question if Rose would marry him. The DNA test results in the envelope confirmed what Rose had always suspected but had been too afraid to verify. James Richardson was my biological father. Harold had known this truth, at least suspected it strongly for my entire life. It explained everything. The way he could never quite connect with me, the constant disappointment in his eyes, the feeling that I was always falling short of some impossible standard. "But why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. Eleanor reached over and took my hands in hers. "Because you deserve to know who you really are, sweetheart, and because Harold's treatment of you isn't about anything you've done wrong. It's about his own insecurities, his own fears. He's been punishing you for a situation that was never your fault." She told me more about James, how he'd wanted to marry Rose and raise me as his own daughter, how he'd been devastated when Rose chose Harold instead, how he'd moved across the country shortly after I was born, unable to bear watching another man raise his child. She even had his current address, had been keeping track of him all these years, in case this day ever came. As I sat there holding those DNA results, feeling like my entire identity had been turned upside down, Eleanor made me promise something. "Don't confront Harold yet," she said. "This kind of truth is a weapon, and weapons should only be used when you absolutely have to. Wait for the right moment, when you have the strength to handle whatever comes next." I left Eleanor's house that day feeling like I was walking in someone else's life. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, had been built on a foundation of lies and half-truths. But along with the shock and hurt, there was also something else, a strange sense of relief. Finally, I understood why I'd never quite fit into Harold's vision of the perfect family. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough. It was because I'd never been his to begin with. The months leading up to graduation were a careful balancing act. I carried Eleanor's revelation like a secret flame inside my chest. Something powerful and dangerous that could either light my way forward or burn down everything I'd ever known. Harold's behavior toward me didn't change. If anything, it got worse as graduation approached. It was as if he resented even having to attend the ceremony, as if my academic success was somehow an inconvenience to his busy schedule. The week before graduation, Harold made it clear that this was going to be the end of his financial support. "You're 22 years old," he announced over dinner. not bothering to look up from his steak. Time to stand on your own 2 feet. I've done my duty, got you through college. The rest is up to you. Rose sat there in her usual silence, occasionally shooting me apologetic glances that did nothing to soften the blow. Dennis, home from his junior year at a party school that Harold was happily funding, just shrugged and asked if he could have my room once I moved out. The casual cruelty of it all was breathtaking. But I had been preparing for this. I'd already been accepted to a graduate program with a full scholarship, something I hadn't bothered to share with Harold because I knew he'd find some way to diminish it. I had my own plans, my own future mapped out, and for the first time in my life, Harold's approval wasn't part of the equation. Graduation day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring morning that makes you believe anything is possible. I got ready in my childhood bedroom, looking at myself in the mirror as I adjusted my cap and gown. In a few hours, I'd officially be Martha Henderson, Bachelor of Arts, summa cum laude. I'd done it entirely on my own merit, despite Harold's constant undermining, despite the secret weight of knowing I didn't really belong in this family. The ceremony itself was everything I'd hoped it would be. Walking across that stage to receive my diploma, hearing my name announced along with my academic honors, seeing the pride on Eleanor's face in the audience, it felt like vindication for all those years of struggle. For a brief, shining moment, I thought maybe Harold would surprise me. Maybe seeing his daughter graduate with the highest honors would finally crack through his wall of indifference. But when I looked out into the audience and saw his face, that familiar expression of mild irritation mixed with boredom, I knew nothing had changed. He was checking his phone during the ceremony, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Rose was trying to get his attention, pointing toward the stage where I was standing, but he barely glanced up. The moment that really crystallized everything came when they announced the special academic awards. I'd won the Departmental Award for Excellence in Literature, a recognition that came with a monetary prize and was only given to one student per year. As I walked across the stage to accept the award, I could hear other families cheering and applauding. When I looked out into the audience, I saw Eleanor clapping enthusiastically, tears streaming down her face. I saw Rose giving me a proud smile and a thumbs up. And I saw Harold, still looking at his phone, completely oblivious to what was happening on stage. That's when I knew. This was never going to change. No amount of achievement, no level of success, no perfect performance would ever be enough to earn Harold's love or respect. And suddenly, I realized I didn't want it anymore. What I wanted was the truth. What I wanted was to stop pretending that we were a normal, happy family when we were all just actors playing roles we'd never auditioned for. My hand went instinctively to my purse, where I'd been carrying Eleanor's envelope for months, the DNA results that would explain everything. The truth that would finally set me free from Harold's impossible expectations. As I walked back to my seat, diploma in hand, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. The family celebration dinner was held at Martello's, Harold's favorite upscale Italian restaurant, where he was known by name and treated like visiting royalty. It was the kind of place with white tablecloths, soft lighting, and prices that made normal people wince. Harold had reserved a private dining room for our extended family, which included my aunts Judith and Beverly, my uncle Stanley, and several cousins I barely knew, but who had been summoned to witness my graduation achievement, as Harold called it with barely concealed sarcasm. The irony wasn't lost on me that Harold was celebrating my graduation at a restaurant where the cheapest entree cost more than I'd spent on food in an entire week during college. But this was Harold's style. Big gestures that looked generous from the outside but felt hollow and performative when you were on the receiving end. The dinner started pleasantly enough. Aunt Judith, Harold's younger sister, made a lovely toast about family pride and accomplishment. Uncle Stanley, who had always been kinder to me than Harold ever was, asked thoughtful questions about my future plans. Even some of the cousins seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my academic achievements. But I could feel the tension building in Harold throughout the meal. He was drinking more than usual, his face getting redder with each glass of wine. Every time someone praised my accomplishments, every time the conversation turned to my future, I could see him getting more agitated. It was like watching a pressure cooker building up steam, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. The moment came when Aunt Beverly asked about my plans for graduate school. I had been accepted to several programs, but I'd chosen the one with the full scholarship, which meant I wouldn't need any financial support from Harold. I was actually excited to share this news, thinking that maybe Harold would be relieved to know he wouldn't have to pay for my continued education. Actually, I said, setting down my fork and addressing the table, I've been accepted to the graduate program at Northwestern with a full scholarship. I'll be starting my master's in comparative literature in the fall. The table erupted in congratulations. Aunt Judith clapped her hands together in delight. Uncle Stanley raised his glass in another toast. Even the cousins seemed impressed. But Harold's reaction was completely different. His face went from red to purple, and I could see a vein throbbing in his temple. Graduate school? He said, his voice getting louder with each word. More school? Haven't you wasted enough time on useless degrees? When are you going to get a real job and start contributing to society instead of hiding in academia like some ivory tower princess? The table went quiet. Rose reached over and put her hand on Harold's arm, trying to calm him down, but he shook her off. I could feel everyone's eyes on us, the uncomfortable tension that comes when a family argument erupts in public. Harold, Uncle Stanley said quietly, maybe we should. No. Harold cut him off, standing up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of throwing good money after bad. I'm done supporting this ungrateful child who thinks the world owes her something just because she can memorize textbooks. I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my own body. This was really happening. Harold was really about to cut me off, publicly, in front of our entire extended family, on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. As of today, Harold continued, his voice carrying across the private dining room, you're on your own, Martha. No more money, no more support, no more nothing. You want to play at being an adult? Fine, figure it out yourself. But he wasn't done. The alcohol and years of resentment had loosened his tongue, and the words that came next would change everything forever. Besides, Harold said, looking directly at me with cold, cruel eyes, you're not my real daughter anyway, so why should I keep pretending to care? The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat. Could hear the soft jazz music playing in the main dining room. Could hear someone at another table laughing, completely unaware that my world had just exploded. Rose's face had gone completely white. Aunt Judith's mouth was hanging open. Uncle Stanley looked like he'd been slapped. But me? I felt strangely calm. After months of carrying Eleanor's secret, after years of wondering why I never quite fit into Harold's vision of family, everything suddenly made perfect sense. The truth was finally out in the open, ugly and brutal and undeniable. I looked around the table at my family's shocked faces, and I realized that this was my moment. The moment Eleanor had told me to wait for. The moment when I had the strength to handle whatever came next. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than they had any right to be. I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope I'd been carrying for 6 months. And for the first time in my entire life, I smiled at Harold with genuine confidence. Well, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence, since we're sharing DNA secrets tonight, I think everyone should know the whole truth. Walking to the front of the private dining room felt like the longest and shortest journey of my life. Every step was deliberate, purposeful, and I could feel the weight of 22 years of secrets and lies pressing down on my shoulders. But instead of feeling crushed by that weight, I felt liberated by it. Finally, I was going to tell the truth. The dining room had gone completely silent, except for the soft clink of silverware and quiet conversations from the main restaurant beyond our closed doors. My family sat frozen in their chairs, staring at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into their private gathering. Harold's face had shifted from angry red to a pale, sickly color as he watched me position myself where everyone could see me clearly. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my graduation, I began, my voice steady and clear. And thank you, Harold, for finally saying out loud what we've all been pretending not to know for 22 years. I held up the manila envelope, and I saw recognition flash across Harold's face. He knew what this was. He'd known this day might come eventually. You're absolutely right, I continued, looking directly at Harold. You're not my biological father. But what's interesting is that Eleanor gave me more than just DNA results about my own parentage. She gave me a complete picture of our family's relationship with truth. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first set of documents. These DNA results confirm that James Richardson is my biological father, the man who wanted to marry my mother and raise me as his own daughter, the man who was driven away by your need to control the perfect family image. Rose was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face. Aunt Judith and Uncle Stanley exchanged glances that told me they weren't entirely surprised by this revelation. But I wasn't done. The real bombshell was still coming. "But here's what none of you knew," I said, pulling out a second set of documents. "Eleanor wasn't just keeping my secret all these years. She was keeping Harold's secret, too." Harold started to stand up, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Sit down, Harold. You wanted to share family secrets? Let's share them all." The second DNA test was older, the paper slightly yellowed with age. This test was done 30 years ago, when Harold was having some medical issues and needed family medical history. Eleanor ordered it secretly because she had suspicions about Harold's own parentage. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member before delivering the truth that would shatter everything Harold thought he knew about himself. "The man you've called grandfather your entire life, Theodore Henderson, was not your father, Harold. He was your grandfather. Your biological father was actually your mother's father-in-law, which makes you the product of the same kind of family complication you've been punishing me for my entire life." The silence that followed was absolute. Harold's mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. Uncle Stanley, who was Theodore's son and Harold's half-brother by blood, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Eleanor's husband didn't die in Korea," I continued, my voice getting stronger with each revelation. "He left when he discovered that his young wife, Agnes, was pregnant by his own father. Eleanor raised Harold as a single mother, just like she always told everyone, but not because she was a war widow. Because she was abandoned by a man who couldn't handle the shame of what had happened in his own family." Harold finally found his voice. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You're lying. Eleanor would have told me." "Eleanor kept your secret for the same reason she kept mine," I said, holding up both sets of DNA results. "Because she loved us and wanted to protect us from the truth. But the difference is, I never used my illegitimate status as an excuse to be cruel to anyone else. You've spent my entire life punishing me for a sin you were guilty of yourself." I walked closer to Harold, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, close enough to smell the wine on his breath and the fear in his sweat. "James Richardson still lives in Oregon," I said quietly, so that only Harold could hear. "He owns a small bookstore, never married, and has been wondering about his daughter for 22 years. Eleanor gave me his address. Tomorrow, I'm going to call him and introduce myself. I'm going to build a relationship with a father who actually wants me in his life." Harold grabbed my wrist, his grip tight enough to hurt. "You can't," he hissed. "You can't destroy this family." I looked down at his hand on my wrist, then back up at his face. "I'm not destroying anything, Harold. I'm just finally telling the truth. The family was destroyed a long time ago by secrets and lies, and people like you, who think love is something that has to be earned instead of something that should be given freely." I pulled my wrist free and stepped back, addressing the whole table again. "I want everyone here to understand something. I didn't choose to reveal these secrets to hurt anyone. I revealed them because Harold decided to humiliate me publicly, to reject me in front of our entire family, and to use my parentage as a weapon. Well, if we're going to use DNA as a weapon, then everyone should know that Harold's been throwing stones from a glass house his entire life." The aftermath of my revelation was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Harold sat back down heavily in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The confident, controlling businessman who had dominated every room he'd ever entered was gone, replaced by a confused, frightened man who was suddenly questioning everything he thought he knew about his own identity. Uncle Stanley was the first to break the stunned silence. "Harold," he said quietly, "is this true? Are we actually half-brothers?" Harold's hands were shaking as he reached for his wine glass. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anything anymore." Rose, who had been crying silently throughout my speech, suddenly stood up and faced Harold with more backbone than I'd seen from her in years. "It's all true," she said, her voice stronger than I expected. "All of it. I was in love with James Richardson, and Martha is his daughter. I chose you because you offered security, because I was young and scared and pregnant. And I've regretted that choice every single day for 22 years. The confession hit Harold like a physical blow. He stared at Rose as if he'd never seen her before, which, in a way, he hadn't. This was Rose without the mask of submission. Rose telling the truth for the first time in over 2 decades. "James wanted to marry me," Rose continued, tears streaming down her face but her voice steady. He wanted to raise Martha and give her his name and love her unconditionally. But I was terrified of being poor, terrified of struggling, so I chose the safe option. I chose the man who could give me a nice house and financial security. And Martha has paid the price for my cowardice her entire life. Aunt Beverly, who had been quietly processing everything, suddenly spoke up. Eleanor knew all of this? Our mother carried these secrets for decades? I nodded, pulling out Eleanor's letter from the envelope. She wrote this for Harold, but she asked me to share it if this day ever came. I unfolded the handwritten pages, Eleanor's careful script covering both sides. She wanted you to understand why she never told you about your parentage, Harold. I began reading Eleanor's words aloud. My dearest Harold, if Martha is reading this letter, it means the truth has finally come out, and I pray you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman's lies. I never told you about your real father because I wanted to protect you from the shame I carried. Your grandmother, Agnes, was a lonely young woman married to a much older man, and when Theodore's father came to live with them after his wife died, nature took its course. The scandal nearly destroyed our family, and I couldn't bear the thought of you growing up with that burden. Harold's face was buried in his hands now, and his shoulders were shaking. For the first time in my life, I saw him as vulnerable, as human, as someone who had been carrying his own invisible wounds. She goes on to say, I continued, that she hoped you would be able to love Martha despite the circumstances of her birth, because you, of all people, should understand what it's like to be caught in the middle of adult mistakes. She says she watched you struggle with fatherhood and wondered if some part of you knew the truth about both of your situations. I folded the letter and looked around the table at my family, these people who had been bound together by secrets and lies for so long that none of us knew how to function in the light of truth. I don't hate you, Harold, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. I pity you. You could have chosen to love me despite my parentage, the same way Eleanor chose to love you despite yours. Instead, you chose to punish an innocent child for the mistakes of adults. And in doing so, you've missed out on knowing your daughter, or the person you raised as your daughter, for 22 years. Harold looked up at me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw something that might have been regret in his eyes. Martha, he started, but I held up my hand. I'm not done, I said. James Richardson didn't just want to raise me as his daughter. According to Eleanor's research, he's a good man who built a successful business, who volunteers at literacy programs, who never stopped wondering about the daughter he never got to know. Tomorrow I'm going to call him, and next week I'm going to Oregon to meet my real father. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harold could try to stop me, could threaten to cut me off financially, but we all knew that ship had already sailed. I was 22 years old, financially independent, and for the first time in my life, completely free from his control. And what about us? Rose asked quietly. What about this family? I looked at her, this woman who had made a choice 23 years ago that affected all of our lives, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Compassion. That depends, I said, on whether anyone in this family is interested in building something honest, instead of continuing to live a lie. 3 months had passed since the graduation dinner that changed everything, and I was sitting in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, waiting to meet my biological father for the third time. The first meeting had been awkward, emotional, and overwhelming for both of us. The second had been easier, filled with getting-to-know-you conversations and tentative steps toward building a relationship. This third meeting felt different. It felt like coming home. James Richardson was everything Eleanor had told me he would be, and nothing like Harold. Where Harold was loud and commanding, James was quiet and thoughtful. Where Harold demanded attention, James gave it freely. He was 51 years old, with gentle brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that were permanently stained with ink from working in his bookstore. When he smiled, which he did often, it reached his eyes in a way that Harold's never had. I brought you something, James said, sliding a wrapped package across the small table between us. Inside was a first-edition copy of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, inscribed with a note, "For my daughter Martha, who has more courage than Elizabeth Bennet, and more wisdom than I ever had at 22. Welcome to your real family. Love, Dad." The word Dad hit me like a physical sensation. I'd never called Harold that, had always used his first name, because Dad somehow felt too intimate for our relationship. But with James, it felt natural, earned, right. "There's something else," James said, pulling out a manila folder that looked suspiciously familiar. "I've been in touch with Eleanor." This was news to me. I'd been calling Eleanor weekly since the graduation dinner. but she hadn't mentioned being in contact with James. She wanted me to give you this, he continued, handing me a thick envelope. It's everything she collected over the years about Harold's family history, and about mine. She thought you might want the complete picture now that you're building a new relationship with both sides of your real family. Inside the envelope were photographs I'd never seen, documents about James's family history, and a detailed family tree that showed both legitimate and illegitimate branches stretching back 4 generations. What struck me most was how common these family complications were. Almost every generation had someone who didn't quite fit the official story, someone whose parentage was questionable, or whose existence had been covered up. Eleanor also told me about what happened at your graduation dinner, James said carefully. How you handled Harold and revealed the family secrets. I looked up from the photographs, suddenly nervous about his reaction. Are you disappointed in me for causing such a scene? James laughed, a warm sound that filled the coffee shop corner where we were sitting. Disappointed? Martha, I've never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. You stood up to a bully who had been tormenting you for 22 years. You told the truth when everyone around you was content to live with lies. You showed more courage in one evening than most people show in a lifetime. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. I've been wondering about you and worrying about you for 22 years. I've imagined 1,000 different scenarios for how you might have turned out, what kind of person you might become. And you've exceeded every one of my hopes. You're brilliant, you're brave, you're kind, even to people who don't deserve it. I couldn't be more proud to be your father. The conversation turned to practical matters. My graduate program was going well, funded entirely by scholarships and a teaching assistantship that James had helped me research and apply for. I'd found a small apartment near campus, nothing fancy but mine, in a way that Harold's house had never been. For the first time in my life, I was building something that belonged entirely to me. What about Harold and Rose? James asked. Have you talked to them since that night? This was the complicated part. Harold had tried to reach out several times, mostly through Rose and Eleanor. His messages were confusing, a mixture of apology and defensiveness that suggested he still didn't fully understand the impact of his 22 years of emotional abuse. Rose had been more direct, calling to apologize for her role in the family dysfunction, and to ask if there was any way to repair our relationship. I've been thinking about forgiveness, I told James. Not for their sake, but for mine. Eleanor says that carrying anger is like carrying poison, and she's probably right. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen, or opening myself up to more hurt. James nodded thoughtfully. Forgiveness can be a process, not a destination. You can forgive someone for your own peace of mind without necessarily wanting them in your life. We talked about Uncle Stanley, who had reached out to both James and me after discovering that he and Harold were half-brothers. The revelation had actually brought Stanley and me closer together. He was horrified by how Harold had treated me and wanted to make amends for the family's failures. Aunt Judith and Beverly had also been supportive, reaching out to express their regret for not speaking up when they witnessed Harold's treatment of me over the years. The funny thing is, I told James, breaking all those family secrets apart actually brought some of us closer together. The people who were willing to deal with the truth honestly turned out to be the people worth having relationships with. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, James handed me one more gift, a key to his bookstore. I know you're focused on your graduate studies, he said, but if you ever want a part-time job where you can be surrounded by books and have flexible hours, you're always welcome. Consider it a standing offer from a father who has 22 years of support to make up for. Walking back to my rental car, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The solid, unshakable knowledge that I was loved unconditionally. Not for my achievements, not for meeting someone else's expectations, but simply for being who I was. It was a feeling I wanted to protect and nurture, a feeling that made me understand what family was supposed to be about. As I sit here today, 6 months after that life-changing graduation dinner, I'm struck by how much can change when you finally decide to stop living other people's lies and start telling your own truth. I'm 23 now, halfway through my first year of graduate school, working part-time at James's bookstore, and building the kind of life I never dared to dream about when I was trapped in Harold's version of family. The relationship with James has continued to grow stronger. We talk on the phone twice a week, and I visit Portland once a month. He's teaching me about the book business, and I'm helping him organize author readings and literary events. It's the kind of partnership I always imagined having with a parent, based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than fear and obligation. Eleanor, now 79, has become even more precious to me. Sharing those family secrets lifted a weight from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for decades. She's moved into a senior living community near my university, and we have dinner together every Sunday. She tells me stories about the family history I never knew, about ancestors who were rebels and writers and independent thinkers. I'm learning that strength and courage run in my bloodline, just not from the direction I always thought. The situation with Harold and Rose remains complicated. Harold has sent several letters, each one a little more self-aware than the last. He started therapy, according to Rose, trying to understand why he treated me the way he did, and how his own childhood affected his parenting. The letters are progress, I suppose, but they don't erase 22 years of emotional damage. I've written back twice, polite but distant responses that acknowledge his efforts without committing to rebuilding our relationship. Rose has been more persistent in her efforts to reconnect. She divorced Harold 6 months after the graduation dinner, a decision that shocked everyone except Eleanor, who told me she'd been waiting 30 years for Rose to find her backbone. Rose is living in a small apartment, working as a secretary again for the first time since I was born, and slowly discovering who she is when she's not trying to manage Harold's moods and expectations. I've had coffee with Rose a few times, careful meetings in neutral locations, where we try to navigate the wreckage of our family history. She's expressed genuine remorse for not protecting me from Harold's treatment, for choosing financial security over love all those years ago, for enabling a family dynamic that hurt everyone involved. These conversations are difficult but necessary, part of my own healing process. I don't expect you to forgive me, Rose said during our last meeting. I just want you to know that I see now what I should have seen then. You deserved better from both of us. Dennis, surprisingly, has been the most straightforward about everything. He called me a month after the graduation dinner and said, simply, "I'm sorry I was such a spoiled brat. I knew Harold treated you differently, and I should have said something." He's transferred to a different university, one where he's actually studying instead of just partying, and he's paying his own way with student loans and a part-time job. We're not close, but we're not enemies either. Sometimes siblings just grow up to be acquaintances, and that's okay too. The most unexpected development has been my relationship with Uncle Stanley. Learning that he and Harold are half-brothers created a bond between us based on shared experience with family secrets and complicated parentage. Stanley has become something like the father figure I never had, someone who combines the stability Harold pretended to offer with the genuine care James provides. He's helped me navigate the legal aspects of changing my name from Henderson to Richardson, a process I completed last month. My academic work has flourished in ways I never expected. Writing my thesis on family secrets in 19th century literature has given me a framework for understanding my own experience and a way to transform personal pain into scholarly insight. My professors are impressed with the depth and authenticity of my analysis, and I've been invited to present my research at several academic conferences. But perhaps the most important change is internal. I wake up each morning knowing that I'm living an authentic life built on truth rather than lies. I'm not performing for anyone's approval or trying to earn love that should be freely given. I'm building relationships with people who value me for who I am, not for who they want me to be. The courage it took to stand up in that restaurant and reveal those family secrets has given me strength in other areas of my life. I speak up in seminars when I disagree with a professor's interpretation. I set boundaries with people who try to take advantage of my naturally helpful nature. I pursue opportunities that interest me rather than ones that look impressive to others. If I could go back and change that graduation dinner, I'm not sure I would. Yes, it was painful and dramatic and probably traumatized several family members. But it was also the moment when I stopped being a victim of other people's choices and started being the author of my own story. The envelope Eleanor gave me that day contained more than DNA results and family secrets. It contained permission to tell the truth, to demand better treatment, to walk away from relationships that were harming me. It contained the key to my own freedom. To anyone watching this, who feels trapped in a family dynamic that diminishes them, who feels like they're never good enough no matter what they achieve, who suspects that family secrets are being used as weapons against them, you have more power than you think. The truth might be painful, but it's also liberating. And sometimes, the family you build for yourself is stronger and more loving than the one you were born into. Family isn't just about DNA or legal relationships or shared last names. Family is about love, support, acceptance, and the willingness to show up for each other through good times and bad. By that definition, James has been more of a father to me in 6 months than Harold was in 22 years. And Eleanor, who kept family secrets to protect the people she loved, has been more of a parent to me than the two people who were supposed to fill that role. I don't know what the future holds for my relationships with Harold and Rose. Maybe we'll eventually build something new and healthier. Maybe we'll remain politely distant. Maybe they'll do the work to understand the damage they caused. Or maybe they won't. But I know that my happiness and self-worth are no longer dependent on their choices. I'm Martha Richardson now, daughter of James Richardson and Rose Henderson, granddaughter of Eleanor Henderson, and author of my own story. And that story is just beginning. Have you ever had to confront family secrets that were affecting your life? How did you find the courage to speak your truth when everyone around you was committed to living a lie? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our experiences helps others find their own strength. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family, courage, and the power of truth. And please share this with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone in dealing with complicated family dynamics. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you deserve to be loved for exactly who you are, not for who others think you should be. May you find the courage to live your truth and the wisdom to build the family you deserve, whether that's the one you were born into or the one you choose for yourself.